Hello, this is Herb Owen, and today we want to talk about how to tell a story. If you're going to teach kids, you've got to learn to be a good storyteller. In Matthew chapter 13, we read that Jesus had told a story about a farmer planting seed. And then we read Jesus used stories to tell all these things to the people. He always used stories to teach people. Now, why did he do that? Simply, Jesus knew how to communicate. He knew that stories were the best way to teach truth so people could understand it. Now, you may say, yeah, but he used parables. Well, what is a parable? Look at this word. The first part is the part that says para. Now, that's a Greek preposition. It means beside. So a parable is a story you place beside something else. Now, you've seen that para in the word parallel, two lines that are beside each other. Well, consider this. You have a truth you want to teach, and for them to understand it, you tell a story, and then you explain that the story is like the truth. A great way to communicate so people could understand it. Now, why is that important? Well, over 100 years ago, a man named John Milton Gregory wrote a book that's become a classic. It's called The 7 Laws of Teaching. And in his book, Gregory explains the law of the lesson that says, the truth to be taught must be learned through truth already known. So when Jesus told the story of the farmer planting seed, well, people knew about farmers planting seed. They probably had all planted seed. And they knew that some of it fell on the hard ground and it never grew, and birds picked up some of it. But some of the seed would fall on good ground and it would grow and flourish. And Jesus was explaining that's how it is when he teaches God's truth. Sometimes people don't get it at all, and sometimes Satan takes it away before they have the chance to consider it. But in some people's lives, God's truth is like that seed that falls on good ground. People could understand that, which is why Jesus told the story. So when you teach kids, you've got to learn to be a good storyteller. Now, how do you make a good story? Think of a story as a play that has 3 acts. Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Whether your story is a 4-minute story you tell on Sunday morning or a 2-hour screenplay you're writing for a movie, good stories usually have 3 acts, and each act serves a different purpose. In Act 1, we meet the person the story is about. We call him or her the protagonist. Now, the protagonist could be a man, a woman, a boy, a girl, a dog, a robot, or a group of people. But the protagonist is important. That's who the story is about. And then we learn that the protagonist has an intent. That's something that the protagonist, the hero of the story, wants to see happen. Now, it could be somewhere he wants to go, or something he wants to do, or an enemy he wants to defeat, or something he wants to find, or a mystery he wants to solve. In Act 1, we meet the protagonist and we discover what his intent is. What is it he's trying to do? Now, that's not a story yet. That's just getting started. The story gets interesting in Act 2, where we find out what the obstacle is that's keeping the protagonist from fulfilling his intent. Something is stopping him. Now, it could be more than one obstacle, but most of the story tells how the protagonist faces and hopefully overcomes the obstacles that are in his way. And then in Act 3, we have the resolution. That's when hopefully the protagonist has overcome the obstacles and has fulfilled his intent. Sometimes it ends different ways, but that's what a story is. Let me give you an example. Let's meet these 3 guys. They're astronauts, and they were the flight crew for Apollo 13, the 3rd moon landing mission. Their intent was simple. They were going to get to the moon, land, do experiments, and arrive home safely. But a couple of days into their journey to the moon, they hit the obstacle. You may remember that line, Houston, we have a problem. What they didn't know at the time, but they discovered later, is that the side of their module had blown out. That was an explosion that caused all sorts of problems. Soon they realized that they were not going to the moon. They were running out of oxygen. It was cold in the command module. They didn't have enough power to keep the computer going. Suddenly the intent changes. Their intent is not to land on the moon, it's to get home safely. And the story as it unfolded, which really happened, tells how they overcame their obstacles to arrive home safely. That's a picture of their command module landing in the Pacific Ocean and the astronauts being lifted up to safety. That is a great story, and it really happened and teaches us how we can make great stories. Now, just telling what happened is not storytelling. It's journalism, like a reporter on the evening news, or maybe somebody writing an article for Wikipedia. That's not how you tell a story. Always tell a story through the perspective of the person who was changed. That's the protagonist. You tell the story from his perspective, or her perspective, or their perspective. Now let's review our terms. A protagonist is who the story is about and was changed in the process. The intent is what the protagonist sets out to do. The obstacle is whatever it is that's keeping the protagonist from accomplishing the intent. And the resolution is the result of what happens as the protagonist, working to accomplish the intent, faces the obstacles. It's how the story ends. Now, when telling your story, be careful not to speak with words that your audience cannot understand. The best way to learn what words kids can understand is to listen to them talk. And then you talk like they do. And you can learn to speak so they can understand. Something else, a good story will build and release tension. This keeps the story interesting and the listener involved. Think of it as it getting so exciting the audience sort of goes to the edge of their seat and then falls back. That's great storytelling. And even in a short story, you can do that. Also, remember that your objective is not to help your audience know the Bible better. No, you want to help your listeners come to know God better through Jesus Christ. Never forget that the entire Bible is about Jesus. Really? Even the Old Testament? Let me show you. You know what happened Easter Sunday morning when Jesus was raised from the dead and the people went to the tomb and found he wasn't there, and then one of them saw him and found out that he was risen? Well, do you know what happens on Easter Sunday afternoon? Luke tells us. Two men were walking from Jerusalem back to their home in a little city called Emmaus. It was a little town outside Jerusalem. And as they walked, a stranger started walking with them. They didn't realize that that was no stranger, that was Jesus. But they'd find that out later. And the stranger heard them talking and said, "What is this you're talking about?" And they said, "Are you new around here? Haven't you heard everything that happened about Jesus? We thought he was the Messiah and he's been dead for 3 days. And Jesus says, "What things?" And they told him. Jesus said, "You foolish people and slow to understanding all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't Jesus supposed to suffer these things?" And then it says, then Jesus began to explain everything that had been written about himself in the scriptures. He started with Moses, and then he talked about what all the prophets had said about him. You see, the whole Bible is about Jesus. And in your teaching, whether in Old Testament or New Testament, you want to point your listeners to Jesus. Now let's talk about a few sample stories. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, we meet a protagonist, Moses, who goes to Pharaoh, and his intent is to get the Jews out of Egypt so they won't be slaves anymore. So he goes to see Pharaoh, and Moses says, "This is what God says, let my people go." And suddenly, the obstacle is very obvious. Pharaoh says, "Well, who is the Lord that I should listen to him?" And the story unfolds as Moses and Pharaoh and God fight their battle. And of course, the story is resolved as Moses leads the people finally out of Egypt. But then we have a new story. As they leave Egypt, Their intent is now to get to the promised land safely. But the first obstacle is the Red Sea. There's this big body of water in front of them. And as they figure out how to cross it, they realize the army of Egypt has changed their mind and they're coming after them. And of course, the Red Sea opens and Moses and the people pass through it. Then the Red Sea goes back as it was and drowns those from the army of Egypt that had followed them. So our obstacle is overcome, but then new obstacles present themselves. The obstacle of the people's unbelief and griping and complaining. Then the story unfolds until the people finally get to the border of the promised land, right across the Jordan River. And the story ends as Joshua takes over. Let's look at another story. You know this one, David and Goliath. Now, with this, you've got to figure out who the protagonist is because you're going to tell the story from their perspective. The protagonist is not Goliath. He's the antagonist. And believe it or not, it's not even David. He knows what he's going to do. This is no problem for him. He knows God will be with him. The protagonist is the army of Israel. They're scared to death and have no idea how they're going to defeat the Philistines. David, in defeating the enemy in their behalf, did exactly what Jesus did when he defeated death for us. Jesus defeated sin and death in our place. David defeated Goliath and the army of the Philistines in place of the army of Israel. They were changed as they saw God's power in defeating their enemy. Then we go to the New Testament, and there's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, there are four possible protagonists. There's Jesus, of course. There are the disciples. There are all the hungry people, and there's the little kid with the lunch. Tell the story from the perspective of the disciples, because they're the ones that come to Jesus and said, all these people are starving, you got to send them home. And Jesus says, well, give them something to eat. And they say, man, half of your salary wouldn't feed them. So there's a little boy with the lunch, and in this event, the disciples see the creative power of Jesus in feeding the multitude. How about Paul and Silas in jail in Acts chapter 16? They are not the protagonists. You know why? They knew what was going to happen. They knew God would be with them. There was an earthquake, and the jailer knew he was going to be executed because his prisoners got out. He takes that spear and about to stab himself, and Paul says, hey, don't do yourself any harm. We're still here. And the jailer turns and says, what do I have to do to be saved? And Paul explains, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. You see, the protagonist is the jailer. Tell the story from his perspective. He's the one who saw what God would do. He's the one that became a follower of Jesus. How about in Luke chapter 15? Most people miss this one. It's the story of what we call the three lost things: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. Now, these three things are in the story, but that's not who it's about. The story of the lost sheep isn't really about the sheep, and the story of the lost coin isn't really about the coin, and the story of the lost or the prodigal son isn't really about him. You say, well, who's the story about? It's about the shepherd who found his sheep, and the woman who found her coin, and the father who found his son. Because Jesus explains that the way these felt when they found what was lost is just like they feel in heaven when a sinner repents. It's their story. They were changed because they were sad and were joyful. And Jesus explains that's how it is in heaven. There's great joy in the presence of angels when a sinner comes back to God. Well, we've learned a lot about telling stories. Remember what Proverbs 15:2 says. A wise teacher makes learning a joy. That's you. You want to teach stories so they're so exciting your kids will love to learn. So go do it. Go become the best storyteller your kids have ever heard.